In 1998, the quiet town of Springfield, Oregon, was torn apart by the actions of one student whose descent into violence revealed just how fragile the safety of schools could be. Kip Kinkel was only 15 years old when his name became etched into history, not as a student, but as the perpetrator of a tragedy that would leave his classmates, his family, and his community permanently scarred. Kip had always been a troubled child. Teachers described him as bright but erratic, often oscillating between moments of sharp intelligence and bursts of aggression. His parents, both educators, tried desperately to help him, enrolling him in counseling and supporting him through his struggles. But Kip carried a fascination with violence that no amount of therapy seemed to tame. He was obsessed with firearms and explosives, consuming violent media and taking notes on weapons with alarming detail. While many of his peers dabbled in rebellious interests, Kip's fixation ran deeper, darker. At home, his parents struggled to manage him. His father, an outwardly calm man, believed structure and discipline were the only way to guide his son. His mother, more compassionate, often softened the rules. But even with their combined efforts, Kip grew more withdrawn, more defiant, and more dangerous as he entered his teenage years. By the spring of 1998, Kip's world was unraveling. He had recently been caught with a stolen handgun at school and was suspended. His parents were furious, threatening harsher consequences and warning him that his future was hanging by a thread. For Kip, humiliation and fear fused into rage. On May 20th, after a confrontation at school and facing punishment at home, he snapped. That afternoon, Kip retrieved a rifle he had hidden. When his father returned home, Kip shot him in the back of the head. Hours later, when his mother arrived, Kip met her in the garage and killed her too. The boy who had once sat in their classrooms, the son they had sacrificed so much for, had murdered them both. But the horror didn't end there. The next morning, Kip loaded his backpack with guns and ammunition and made his way to Thurston High School. Inside the cafeteria, surrounded by peers who thought of him as just another troubled classmate, he unleashed his fury. He opened fire, spraying bullets into the crowd. Students screamed, tables overturned, bodies fell. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. 2 students were killed, Ben Walker and Mikael Nicholson, while more than 24 others were injured. The cafeteria floor became a scene of carnage, littered with backpacks, spilled food, and blood. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, something remarkable happened. Students fought back. A group of brave teenagers tackled Kip as he reloaded, wrestled him to the ground, and held him all until police arrived. In that moment, terrified children became heroes, stopping further bloodshed with sheer courage. The arrest shocked the town. Kip, just 15, sat in custody, his face blank, his demeanor eerily calm. When investigators searched his home, they uncovered his journals, pages filled with disturbing thoughts, fantasies of killing, and expressions of self-loathing. He wrote of hearing voices, of feeling worthless, of believing the world would be better off without him. The writings painted a chilling portrait of a young man consumed by despair and rage, spiraling toward inevitable violence. The trial was agonizing. Prosecutors charged him as an adult, emphasizing the calculated nature of his actions, the murder of his parents, the stockpiling of weapons, the deliberate attack on his school. The defense argued that Kip was mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations that drove him to kill. Expert witnesses described a boy trapped in a fractured mind, his sense of reality warped beyond repair. The community was divided. Some saw Kip as a monster, irredeemable and deserving of the harshest punishment. Others, reading his journals and hearing testimony of his illness, wondered if he was as much a victim as those he had harmed. But for the families who buried children, for the classmates who would forever carry scars, physical and emotional, the debate was a wound reopened each time his name was spoken. In 1999, Kip Kinkel was sentenced to 111 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The boy, who had once sat quietly in classrooms, who might have lived an ordinary life with different interventions, would spend the rest of his days behind bars. His case became a touchstone in the national conversation about school violence, mental illness, and the accessibility of guns to teenagers. For the survivors, life was never the same. Many of the injured carried permanent physical disabilities. Others lived with nightmares, flashes of trauma that returned each time they heard a loud noise or walked into a cafeteria. Parents wept as they described sending their children to school, supposedly the safest place they could be, only to see them carried out in ambulances. The tragedy at Thurston High School foreshadowed a wave of school shootings that would plague the United States in the years to come. Each new incident would call Kip's name back into the headlines, a reminder of the day when one boy's descent into violence marked the beginning of an era. The haunting reflection of this story lies in its unanswered questions. Could more intervention have saved him? Could stricter oversight of weapons have prevented the massacre? Or was the tragedy inevitable, written in the tortured lines of his journals long before the first shot was fired? For Springfield, Oregon, the answer hardly mattered. The trust between school and family, between teacher and student, had been shattered forever. And for those who walked the blood-stained floors of Thurston High, the memory of May 21st, 1998 would never fade. It was the day childhood ended, the day safety died, the day their school earned a body count. In 1979, in the city of San Diego, California, a quiet suburban neighborhood awoke to a horror that no one could have predicted. At Cleveland Elementary School, children lined up outside the gates, laughing, playing, waiting for the bell to ring. It was an ordinary Monday morning until a gunman opened fire from a house directly across the street. The shooter wasn't an adult stranger, nor was it a masked intruder storming the grounds. It was a 16-year-old girl sitting in her bedroom window, armed with a .22 caliber rifle and a cold detachment that would horrify the world. Her name was Brenda Ann Spencer. Brenda had lived across from the elementary school most of her life. Teachers remembered her as a quiet child, withdrawn, with a streak of bitterness just beneath the surface. Her home life was grim. Her father was strict and emotionally distant. Her mother, absent. Brenda lived in squalor, in a house without warmth, littered with trash, with little comfort or care. She was intelligent, even gifted in some ways, but her intelligence was buried under layers of resentment, anger, and despair. She often voiced hatred for the school across the street. She complained about the noise of children, about the routines of education, about the world itself. To classmates, she sometimes joked about wanting to do something violent, but no one believed her. After all, she was just a thin, red-haired teenager with freckles and a sarcastic smile. On Christmas of 1978, her father gave her a gift that would alter the course of history, a semi-automatic rifle with a scope and 500 rounds of ammunition. To an already disturbed 16-year-old, it was a gift not of joy, but of destruction. On the morning of January 29, 1979, Brenda woke up, looked out her window, and saw the schoolyard filling with children. She loaded her rifle, positioned herself, and began to shoot. The first target was the principal, Burton Ragg, who rushed outside to help students. Brenda's bullet struck him, and he fell to the ground. Then she shot the school custodian, Mike Suture, as he attempted to pull children to safety. Both men died trying to protect others. Children screamed and scattered, some falling, some bleeding. 9 students were struck by bullets. Panic overtook the playground as teachers screamed for kids to duck behind bushes, to crawl into classrooms, to stay down. The innocence of an elementary school morning had been shattered in seconds. The chaos spilled into the streets. Police were called, sirens wailed, and the neighborhood became a war zone. Officers arrived quickly, but as they stepped into the open, Spencer fired at them too. One officer was wounded. For more than 6 hours, the standoff dragged on. Inside her home, Brenda sat calmly with her rifle. When police negotiators contacted her by phone, her responses sent chills through the line. Asked why she had done it, she infamously replied, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." The words were cruel in their casualness, spoken as though mass murder were nothing more than a way to relieve boredom. Finally, she surrendered, walking out of her house with a blank expression, her hands raised. Cameras flashed as officers led her away. A teenage girl in jeans and a sweater, looking far too young to be a killer, had just committed one of the most infamous school shootings in American history. The aftermath stunned the nation. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teachers wondered how to protect classrooms from threats they could barely comprehend. The media swarmed the story, broadcasting Brenda's chilling words across the world. Those 4 words, "I don't like Mondays," would echo in headlines, in songs, in culture itself. The trial was swift. Brenda was tried as an adult despite her age. Psychologists testified about her unstable home life, about signs of depression and potential brain damage from a bicycle accident. But the facts remained: 2 dead, 9 injured, a deliberate attack carried out with precision. In 1980, she pled guilty to 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. Behind bars, Brenda remained a figure of fascination and fear. Over the years, she claimed that her father had abused her, that she felt trapped and hopeless, that the rifle was a gift she never wanted. But the horror of her actions overshadowed any attempt at sympathy. To the families of the victims, to the children who still carried scars, she was the girl who had stolen lives without remorse. The cultural impact of her crime spread farther than anyone expected. The Irish rock band the Boomtown Rats immortalized her words in their hit song, "I Don't Like Mondays," bringing the tragedy to global attention. But for San Diego, the song was salt in a wound, a reminder of the morning their school became a battlefield, and decades later, Brenda Ann Spencer remains in prison. She has applied for parole multiple times, but each hearing brings survivors and victims' families who stand firmly against her release. They remember not only the lives lost, but also the terror of being children caught in the crosshairs of a teenager who turned boredom into bloodshed. The haunting reflection of her story is one that continues to echo today. How does a 16-year-old become capable of such violence? Was it neglect, mental illness, abuse, or the easy access to a weapon? Or was it something darker, something unexplainable? For the children of Cleveland Elementary, the answer hardly matters. They carry the scars of that day, some on their bodies, others deep in their memories. What was once a safe space of learning became a site of nightmares. And in the shadow of Brenda Ann Spencer's window, the innocence of childhood was permanently destroyed. It was January 29th, 1979, when the world first heard the words that would chill generations. "I don't like Mondays." Words that transformed a schoolyard into a graveyard and a teenager into the face of a horror that could never be undone. In 1996, in Moses Lake, Washington, a small town where most families knew each other, the classroom was considered a safe haven. Frontier Middle School was the kind of place where students gathered for basketball games, winter dances, and the everyday rhythm of teenage life. But on February 2nd, that safety was shattered when a 14-year-old student named Barry Lukaitis walked into his algebra class armed with a rifle, a revolver, and enough ammunition to turn a room full of children into a scene of carnage. Barry had always been an outsider. Teachers described him as smart, even gifted in certain subjects, but also deeply withdrawn. He was the kid who sat alone at lunch, the one who didn't quite fit in with sports or social circles. While many teenagers wrestle with identity, Barry's isolation was steeped in anger. He developed a fascination with violent films, novels, and music. Westerns, Stephen King stories, and rock lyrics about chaos and revenge became his internal soundtrack. So at home, things were no better. His parents were caught in a bitter separation. His father was distant, his mother unstable. She openly shared her depression and suicidal thoughts with Barry, even going as far as suggesting that they should die together. For a 14-year-old, this was poison, twisting his already fragile sense of reality. Barry internalized the chaos. Instead of reaching out, he retreated further, constructing fantasies where he was no longer the bullied, ignored boy, but the avenger. He studied shootings, learned how to handle firearms, and thought about how quickly he could gain control of a classroom if he ever tried. These weren't fleeting thoughts. These were blueprints of destruction forming in the mind of a child. On that winter afternoon, he decided to act, dressed in a long black duster coat, echoing the style of the gunslingers he idolized. Barry entered his algebra classroom. His classmates thought at first it was a joke, some strange act for attention. But then he pulled out a rifle, raised it toward the teacher, and fired. Mr. Leroy, the beloved algebra teacher, was struck and killed instantly. Students screamed, ducking under desks, scrambling for cover. Before anyone could fully process what was happening, Barry turned his weapon on the class itself. He shot 2 students, both close to the front. One of them, Manuel Vela, a bright and well-liked boy, was killed. Another student, critically injured, collapsed onto the floor as chaos erupted. The room that moments earlier had been filled with the scratch of pencils and the sound of chalk now echoed with gunfire screams and the shattering of lives. Barry's expression was described as calm almost detached, as if he were living out a script he had rehearsed in his mind. He allegedly made a chilling remark, telling the class, "This sure beats algebra, doesn't it?" The words callous and cruel underscored the depth of his detachment from the horror he was creating. But in the face of terror, bravery emerged. A teacher named John Lane, hearing the shots, rushed toward the classroom. Confronting Barry, he managed to wrestle the gun away, pinning the teenager against the wall until police arrived. Lane's quick action prevented what could have been a much larger massacre. Many believed that without his intervention, Barry had enough ammunition to kill dozens more. The community was left reeling. Parents wept as they embraced their children that night, knowing some families would never again feel the warmth of that embrace. The funerals of Mr. Leroy and Manuel Vela drew hundreds. The entire town gathered in grief. The idea that such violence could erupt in a middle school carried out by one of their own shattered the illusion of safety in small-town America. Barry's trial became one of the first major cases in the modern era of school shootings. Prosecutors painted him as a calculating killer who meticulously planned the attack, choosing his weapons, his clothing, and his timing. The defense argued that Barry was a deeply disturbed child, influenced by his mother's mental illness, by violent media, and by an untreated depression that had spiraled into psychosis. The jury faced a difficult decision. Barry was only 14, but the enormity of his crime demanded accountability. In 1997, he was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and numerous counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to over 200 years in prison, effectively a life sentence with no hope of parole. Behind bars, Barry remained a controversial figure. Some advocates argued that his youth and troubled upbringing should have led to rehabilitation rather than permanent incarceration. Others pointed to the cold-blooded nature of his crimes, the deliberate planning, and the callousness of his words, insisting that he had earned every day of his sentence. For the survivors, the trial did little to heal the wounds. Students who lived through that day described recurring nightmares, panic attacks, and a lifelong mistrust of crowded rooms. Teachers carried the burden of losing a colleague, a friend who had dedicated his life to education, cut down in front of the very students he tried to protect. The haunting reflection of Barry Lukaitis' crime is one that echoes through history. How does a 14-year-old child transform into a killer? Was he a product of a toxic home life, a victim of mental illness, left untreated, or proof of how dangerous violent fantasies can become when given a weapon? For Moses Lake, the questions still linger. The halls of Frontier Middle School were scrubbed clean, classes resumed, but the echoes of gunfire never truly faded. Parents who once believed their children were safe within those walls learned a cruel truth. Even in the most ordinary classrooms, horror can walk in disguised as a child in a long black coat. It was February 2nd, 1996, when innocents died in a small-town algebra class, and a 14-year-old boy proved that schools, no matter how close-knit the community, were no longer untouchable sanctuaries. In 1989, in the city of Stockton, California, an elementary school playground became the site of a nightmare that still haunts survivors decades later. Cleveland Elementary School was like many others, rows of modest classrooms, a cafeteria that smelled of pizza and milk cartons, and a playground filled with laughter and the innocent noise of children. On January 17th, that innocence was shattered when a man armed with a semi-automatic rifle opened fire on a crowd of first and second graders during recess. The gunman was Patrick Purdy, a 24-year-old drifter with a long history of instability, petty crime, and hatred. His life had been a series of failures: broken family relationships, time in foster care, arrests for theft and drugs, and jobs that never lasted. He was bitter, aimless, and full of resentment toward the world. That resentment began to focus on children, particularly those from immigrant families. Stockton, in the late 1980s, had become home to many Southeast Asian refugees, families fleeing war in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. These children, still learning English, filled the classrooms at Cleveland Elementary. For them, the schoolyard was supposed to be a sanctuary from the violence their parents had escaped. But to Purdy, poisoned by prejudice, they became symbols of everything he despised. On the morning of January 17th, Purdy parked his car near the school. Inside were more weapons, ammunition, and even a note declaring his hatred for immigrants and his anger at society. He carried with him an AK-47 style rifle, modified to fire rapidly. Walking onto the playground, he blended for a brief moment into the ordinary scene: children chasing balls, swinging on monkey bars, and lining up for recess. Then he raised the rifle. The first burst of gunfire cracked across the yard. Children screamed and fell. Teachers, horrified, scrambled to push students toward the safety of classrooms. Purdy kept firing, spraying bullets into the crowd of small bodies, cutting down children who had only just learned how to read and write. In less than 2 minutes, he fired over 100 rounds. 5 children were killed instantly, all between the ages of 6 and 9. Nearly 30 others were wounded, some critically, their tiny frames unable to withstand the force of the bullets. The screams of children filled the air, mingling with the frantic shouts of teachers and the chaos of panicked flight. When Purdy had finished his assault, he turned the gun on himself, ending his life with a single shot to the head. In the stunned silence that followed, the playground was a scene of devastation, scattered with backpacks, blood, and toys abandoned in fear. Teachers knelt beside the wounded, trying to stop bleeding with their bare hands, begging children to stay awake until ambulances arrived. The aftermath was one of heartbreak. Parents rushed to the school, many collapsing as they learned their children were among the dead. Stockton's hospitals overflowed with victims, doctors working desperately to save tiny lives torn apart by bullets meant for war zones. The funerals that followed were unbearable. Small coffins carried through the streets, families wailing in grief, a community forever scarred. Nationally, the massacre shocked America. Never before had the country witnessed such large-scale slaughter of children at an elementary school. News footage showed tiny shoes left behind on the playground, blood-stained jackets, and parents clinging to each other in disbelief. Politicians, activists, and citizens demanded answers. How could such a weapon end up in the hands of a man like Purdy, and why were children the ones paying the price? The Stockton schoolyard shooting became a turning point in the gun control debate. Lawmakers pointed to the AK-47 style rifle Purdy had used, arguing that such weapons had no place in civilian life. Within a year, California passed one of the strictest assault weapons bans in the nation, directly influenced by the massacre. Years later, the incident would also play a role in shaping federal discussions about assault weapon regulations. For survivors, however, no legislation could erase the trauma. Children who lived through that day carried psychological scars into adulthood. Some spoke of nightmares that never went away, the sound of gunfire, the sight of classmates falling, the memory of running while friends were left behind. Teachers struggled with guilt, questioning if they could have done more to shield their students. Parents lived with the haunting absence of children who should have grown into teenagers, then adults, but never would. Patrick Purdy's life was dissected endlessly in the aftermath. His history of arrests, mental instability, substance abuse, and hate-filled rants painted the portrait of a man spiraling toward destruction. Yet nothing in his troubled past could justify the choice to unleash hell on a playground filled with children. The haunting reflection of the Stockton tragedy lies in its senselessness. Why target the youngest, most vulnerable members of society? Why transform a place of learning into a killing field? The answers remain as empty as the classrooms that lost their students that day. Decades later, survivors of Cleveland Elementary still gather to remember, lighting candles and speaking the names of those who were lost. The playground has long since been repaired, the blood washed away, the laughter of new generations echoing in the air. But for those who were there on January 17th, 1989, the sound of gunfire will always linger just beneath the surface of memory. It was supposed to be just another day of recess. Instead, it became a day when childhood was stolen in a storm of bullets, when a schoolyard became a graveyard, and when America was forced to confront the horrifying reality of violence in its classrooms. In 2005, in the tiny town of Red Lake, Minnesota, a community bound together by its Ojibwe heritage was thrust into unimaginable grief. Red Lake High School, a place where generations of Native families had studied and graduated, suddenly became the backdrop for one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. The violence was carried out not by an outsider, but by a 16-year-old student named Jeff Wise, whose troubled life foreshadowed the tragedy that would unfold. Jeff had grown up in hardship. His father had taken his own life when Jeff was just a child, and his mother had been left severely disabled after a car accident. Shuffled between relatives and burdened with depression, Jeff carried an air of loneliness that teachers and classmates could not ignore. He was quiet, often withdrawn, spending long hours online, where he immersed himself in dark corners of the internet. There, he became fascinated with violent ideologies, extremist groups, and fantasies of destruction. Students described Jeff as someone who didn't fit in. He dressed in black, sometimes wore a trench coat, and kept to himself. Rumors swirled about his obsession with school shootings, especially Columbine. He had drawn disturbing images in class and written stories about death. His teachers recognized the signs of a troubled mind, but like so many others before him, Jeff's pain was largely invisible to those who might have intervened. On March 21, 2005, Jeff's isolation and anger erupted into violence. That afternoon, he first turned his rage on his own family. At his grandfather's home, Jeff shot and killed him, an act that stunned relatives, as his grandfather was a respected tribal police officer who had cared deeply for Jeff. He also killed his grandfather's companion before stealing his police-issued gun, bulletproof vest, and squad car. Armed and dressed like an officer, Jeff drove to Red Lake High School. Inside, students and staff were going about a normal school day, unaware of the storm approaching. As Jeff pulled up, the sight of a police vehicle did not raise alarms until he stepped out with weapons in hand. He entered through the main doors and opened fire almost immediately. The school's security guard, unarmed and unprepared for such an assault, was one of the first victims. Students screamed and scattered as Jeff moved through the hallways and into classrooms. Witnesses later described him as calm, methodical, and chillingly silent as he pulled the trigger. In one classroom, he gunned down 5 students and a teacher, leaving bodies sprawled across desks and the floor. Others were wounded as bullets tore through walls and windows. The sound of gunfire reverberated through the building, mingling with alarms and the cries of terrified children. Some students hid in closets, others pressed against the floor, praying he would pass them by. The entire attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but the damage was devastating. Jeff killed 7 people inside the school before turning the gun on himself as police closed in. In all, 10 lives were lost that day, including his own, while at least 5 others were left wounded. For a community of only a few thousand, the impact was catastrophic. The aftermath was a blur of sorrow and disbelief. Parents rushed to the school, some finding their children safe, others collapsing in grief as they learned their sons or daughters would never come home. Vigils were held across the reservation, where candles flickered in the cold night air and elders spoke words of healing. The entire Red Lake Nation mourned together, bound by pain and the knowledge that one of their own had inflicted it. Investigators soon pieced together Jeff's troubled life, his writings, his online activity, and the testimony of classmates revealed a boy who had long fantasized about violence, who idolized past shooters, and who felt consumed by hopelessness. He had been on antidepressant medication but showed little improvement. To some, his actions were a cry born of trauma, poverty, and alienation. To others, they were an unforgivable betrayal of a community that had given him chances again and again. The tragedy raised painful questions about mental health on reservations, about access to weapons, and about the invisible struggles of teenagers who feel trapped in despair. Leaders called for more resources for Native youth, pointing to cycles of generational trauma, loss, and neglect. But for families burying their children, the words brought little comfort. The funerals were devastating. Small caskets carried into crowded community centers, the sound of drums echoing as families wept, and prayers rising for young lives cut short. The image of elders comforting parents, of classmates holding hands through tears, became etched in memory. Years later, the Red Lake shooting is still remembered as one of the darkest days in the history of Native communities in America. Survivors have spoken about the lasting scars, nightmares, survivors' guilt, and the difficulty of trusting schools as safe spaces again. Teachers who lived through it carry the weight of the students they couldn't save. The haunting reflection of Jeff Wise's crime is one of contradictions. A boy who had been a victim of loss, of tragedy, of systemic neglect, became the author of More Loss, More Tragedy, and More Neglect. His story forces the question, how many warning signs can be missed before a life explodes into violence? Could intervention have saved him, or was his path already written in the sorrow of his upbringing? For Red Lake, the answer is unchangeable. On March 21st, 2005, the halls of their high school were forever marked with blood, their community forever fractured. It was a reminder that even in the most remote towns, even in places defined by culture and resilience, horror can erupt in an instant. The children of Red Lake deserved laughter, learning, and life. Instead, they were left with a memory of gunfire echoing through classrooms, of a classmate transformed into a killer, and of a community's heart breaking all at once. On the morning of October 2nd, 2006, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a single-room schoolhouse stood quietly among rolling green fields. This was Amish country where life seemed untouched by modern chaos, where horse-drawn buggies traveled along dirt roads, and where faith and simplicity guided daily living. The West Nickel Mines Amish School was supposed to be a sanctuary for learning and innocence, but that day its walls would witness a horror that no one in the Amish community could have imagined. The gunman was not a stranger passing through, but a familiar milk truck driver named Charles Carl Roberts IV. He was a husband, a father of three, and a man outwardly woven into the fabric of local life. Yet beneath that exterior lived deep, festering wounds, grievances from childhood, unspoken rage, and a dangerous obsession with revenge against a world he felt had wronged him. In the days before the attack, Roberts appeared troubled. His wife noticed his restlessness, his silence, the way he scribbled notes that felt like final messages. In one chilling note, he wrote of anger toward God for the loss of his first child, a baby daughter who had died shortly after birth. He carried resentment like a stone in his chest, and on that October morning, he decided to take his vengeance not on those who had hurt him, but on the most innocent targets imaginable, Amish schoolgirls. At around 10:30 a.m., Roberts backed his milk truck up to the one-room schoolhouse. The children inside, ranging from ages 6 to 13, noticed the vehicle but had no reason to panic. When he entered carrying weapons, however, fear rippled through the small room. He ordered the teacher, a 20-year-old woman, and several parents with toddlers to leave. Then he sealed the doors, barricading windows and preparing his victims for what he called payback. Inside the schoolhouse, 10 girls were forced to line up. Roberts carried guns, ammunition, chains, and boards to block the exits. He told the girls he was angry at God, angry at life, and that he intended to kill them before turning the gun on himself. Some of the children began to pray aloud. Others cried quietly. In those harrowing minutes, their childhood innocence was replaced with unimaginable terror. Police were called almost immediately. Within minutes, state troopers surrounded the schoolhouse, negotiating with Roberts through windows. They pleaded for time, urging him to surrender, but Roberts remained calm and chillingly focused. He told the negotiators that if they didn't leave, he would start shooting. Inside, the Amish girls displayed a bravery far beyond their years. One 13-year-old girl reportedly said to Roberts, "Shoot me first, and leave the others go." Another echoed her. Their voices trembled, but their courage was undeniable. At around 11 a.m., Roberts began his assault. He fired his weapon point blank at the children lined up in front of him. Chaos erupted, gunfire echoing across the peaceful farmland, bullets shattering glass and screams filling the tiny schoolroom. Police rushed the building, but in mere moments, Roberts had shot 10 girls, killing 5 and critically injuring 5 more. Then, true to his plan, he turned the gun on himself and ended his life. The carnage was staggering. Young girls, some only 6 years old, lay bleeding on the floor. First responders carried limp bodies out of the schoolhouse, their small shoes and dresses stained red. Ambulances rushed them to hospitals where doctors and nurses fought desperately to save lives. For the Amish community, who live by principles of peace, humility, and forgiveness, the violence was not just a massacre, it was an incomprehensible violation of everything they believed in. Parents gathered at the scene, their faces etched with grief, but their words steeped in faith. Within hours, a decision was made that shocked the nation. The Amish would forgive the killer. At vigils that evening, Amish elders prayed not only for their children, but also for Roberts and his family. They visited his widow, extended their condolences, and even invited her to the funerals of their slain daughters. For them, forgiveness was not an option, it was a commandment, a way of life. The funerals were heartbreaking. Small coffins lowered into the ground, fathers and mothers standing silently in the autumn wind, their pain hidden behind stoic faith. The sound of horses' hooves pulling buggies became part of the mourning procession, a surreal contrast to the violence that had stolen their daughters. The nation watched in awe and disbelief. How could a community forgive so quickly, so fully, when their children had been executed in cold blood? For the Amish, forgiveness was not about erasing pain, but about refusing to let hatred take root. They believed vengeance belonged to God alone. Investigators dug into Roberts' life. His journals revealed decades of simmering resentment. He wrote about dark fantasies, about wanting to hurt young girls, about unresolved guilt and anger toward God. He had planned the attack carefully, stockpiling weapons and restraints. Yet no one in his life had seen the full extent of his unraveling mind. To outsiders, he was simply a quiet milkman, a family man with a job, a home, and responsibilities. The story of the nickel mines schoolhouse shooting became not just one of tragedy, but of radical forgiveness. Books, documentaries, and sermons spread the story worldwide. Some saw the Amish response as a model of true faith. Others questioned whether forgiveness so quick was even possible for ordinary people. For the survivors, however, the scars remained. The 5 girls who lived carried physical and emotional wounds. Some suffered permanent injuries. Their families struggled with trauma. Even as they clung to their faith, the small schoolhouse was torn down, and a quiet meadow replaced it. But for those who lived through that morning, the memory will never fade. The sight of Roberts blocking the doors, the sound of gunfire in a place of prayer, the loss of innocence in a community that had always tried to remain apart from the world's violence. Years later, one of the Amish fathers reflected, "We have to forgive. Without forgiveness, the world is lost, but forgiveness does not mean we forget." Every morning, when we look at the empty places at our tables, we remember. The Nickel Mines Massacre is remembered not just as a school shooting, but as a haunting paradox, the deepest cruelty met with the deepest compassion. It revealed the fragility of innocence, the destructive power of unresolved pain, and the extraordinary resilience of a community rooted in faith. On the morning of May 18, 1927, the children of Bath Township, Michigan, filled the small classrooms of their rural consolidated school. They carried books, lunches packed in paper bags, and the everyday worries of arithmetic lessons and spelling recitations. The school had become a symbol of pride for the farming community, a modern building uniting children from scattered farms into one central institution. But as the bell rang that morning, no one could have anticipated that within hours the building would become the site of the deadliest school massacre in American history. The man behind the slaughter was Andrew Kehoe, a farmer and the school board treasurer. To most, Kehoe was an ordinary figure in the township, a meticulous man who fixed machinery, tended to his land, and managed finances with precision. But those who knew him better described him as bitter, controlling, and consumed by resentment. He often argued with neighbors, snapped at children, and nursed grudges against anyone who crossed him. His biggest grievance, however, was with the school itself. The Bath Consolidated School had been built only a few years earlier, and to fund it, the township levied taxes on local landowners. Kehoe despised the taxes, believing they had driven him deeper into financial ruin. His farm was already failing, his debts piling up, and his wife gravely ill. The school, meant to symbolize progress for the community, became in his mind the embodiment of all his misfortune. Over time, his bitterness twisted into something darker until revenge became his only purpose. Kehoe spent months preparing his plan. He purchased large quantities of pyritol, an explosive surplus from World War I, and dynamite. Quietly, systematically, he stored the materials on his farm and smuggled them into the school basement. As a board member with access to the building, he was able to hide the explosives beneath the floorboards, wiring them carefully. His plan was meticulous, and his intent was not just to kill, but to annihilate the entire school. On the morning of May 18th, he set his plan in motion. Before driving into town, he murdered his ailing wife, Nellie, leaving her body in a wheelbarrow behind their farm buildings. Then he rigged his farm with incendiary devices, ensuring it would go up in flames. With everything prepared, Kehoe left for the school, his truck packed with additional explosives and shrapnel. At 8:45 a.m., the first explosion ripped through the Bath Consolidated School. The north wing of the building erupted, collapsing walls and ceilings onto children and teachers inside. Windows shattered outward, sending glass spraying across the schoolyard. The sound carried for miles, and in the moments after, a choking cloud of dust and smoke poured out of the wreckage. Screams filled the air as children staggered out, bloody and dazed, while others lay trapped under heavy debris. Parents and neighbors rushed from fields and homes. They clawed through the rubble with bare hands, desperate to save the children inside.